Thank you, Dr. Jenkins, and thank you all. I once had to speak after Michelle Obama. That was nothing. That was just amazing and really, really inspiring. So thank you, and thank you all for staying this afternoon. I'm going to talk today about a first world problem, Alzheimer's disease, but one that's very real to us. The passion of my life's work has been to try to understand how we can preserve women's brain functioning from the time it's my daughter in the lower left-hand side to my 101-year-old grandmother who just passed away 1 year ago. So we want to keep our brains healthy and active, and that means preventing Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about women and Alzheimer's disease. I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Jenkins for nominating me for the award. Phenomenal. It's been the honor of a lifetime, and also thank the National Institutes of Health that have funded my research continuously since I was in graduate school. So yay for the NIH. 2/3 of Alzheimer's disease patients are female. A woman with Alzheimer's disease has a higher frequency of Alzheimer's, but not a higher incidence. Okay, so in epidemiology, it's a higher frequency. Among those with the disease, it's more common among women. Incidence is on the fence. We don't quite know yet. Do women have a higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease? The fact is, women need to be concerned about Alzheimer's disease because at age 65, a woman has a 1 in 6 probability of getting a diagnosis of dementia during the remainder of her life compared to a 1 in 11 chance for men. In part, that's because she will live longer than men. And indeed, women in their 60s are more likely to get Alzheimer's disease, twice as likely as they are to get breast cancer, but we don't talk about Alzheimer's disease as much. This is a public health crisis because we are getting older in the United States. There is no cure for Alzheimer's disease. We're not entirely sure how to prevent it. We think we have some good ideas. But the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is expected to triple by 2050. Triple by 2050. And what that means to the United States economy is that this will amount to $20 trillion, including $11.4 trillion to Medicare. So we need to do something about this. And just doing the math, maybe people don't drink the Kool-Aid of sex and gender differences, but just doing the math, if you study sex-specific and sex-related risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and make a tiny dent in that, the return on investment is huge. So numbers alone say to do it, although I agree with Dr. Jenkins, we have to do it because it matters. So there's no cure for Alzheimer's disease, and indeed, sadly, every clinical trial of an Alzheimer's disease intervention has faded. So what do we need to do? We need to focus on prevention. So when you're speaking to your patients about getting healthy, exercising, managing their lipids, managing their hypertension, scare them with Alzheimer's disease. Because the fact of the matter is all of these are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and women are terrified rightly of getting it. I am. I'm sure you all. And all my research is really in self-interest. But so work by Yaffe and Barnes has demonstrated that even if you take something like physical inactivity and you reduce physical inactivity by 10%, you've saved 100,000 cases of Alzheimer's disease. So lifestyle factors matter. Counsel your patients about these lifestyle factors. They are not independent of one another. They are synergistic. So having more than one of these is more than additive. It's synergistic in contributing to Alzheimer's disease. So they need to work on weight and lipids all combined. Now, I've focused my life on sex steroid hormones. I see everything through a peach-colored, pink-colored estrogen lens. But I don't want you to leave with this idea that that's what this is all about, because lifestyle is really important. Compared to men, women have higher BMIs. They have lower rates of exercise in the US and across the globe. They have higher cholesterol levels, higher rates of hypertension in older age, higher rates of depression, twice as high as men, higher rates of television viewing. I personally like to think that John Hamm is very good for my brain, but you know, that's for me to decide. And then there are some non-modifiable risk factors that I think have been instrumental in convincing the rest of the field that sex and gender matters. Specifically, the apolipoprotein E4 allele, the greatest risk factor genetically for Alzheimer's disease later in life. If you have the ApoE allele and you're sitting next to a guy with it, you're twice as likely to get Alzheimer's as he is. controlling for age. So why is that? If we understood that, we could understand more about the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. There are many advantages to being women. One is that you get to hang out with people like this, right? That's fantastic, right? Another one is that we have certain cognitive strengths, among which are verbal memory. So women, this helps you in medical school, remember words and stories and facts better than men. It's a lifelong advantage. Has to do with estrogen, because if we remove estrogen by oophorectomy or Lupron, lower estrogen, you'll see a decrease in that verbal memory. If you add back estrogen in a randomized manner, bounces back, okay? Verbal memory. How do we diagnose Alzheimer's disease? Verbal memory. So if you're giving a mental state exam, you're giving those 3 words, aren't you? You're saying ball, flag, tree. Do you remember them? What kind of test is that? Verbal memory. So some of our work has shown that the fact that women have this advantage in verbal memory tests are used to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. That's bad news for women, and we have to do something about it. Estrogen levels change across the menopausal transition. My mentee, Mia, was one of the first people to discover this. There is a decrease in verbal memory during the menopausal transition, and it bounces back. Good news. In women with HIV, this is a study of 435 women with HIV, followed for 6 years in that study. Women with HIV, low income, urban dwelling, minority women who never enter clinical studies, they too, are those slides up? He's working on it. Oh, okay. Well, just listen to it. Okay. I can see that I could do this. This is the last thing to go when I dement. I'm telling you, I'll be lecturing everybody in the halls about. There they are. Even in these women, you can see this decrease in verbal memory across the menopause. Estrogen takes this away. If you do neuroimaging studies, believe behavior. If performance on a verbal memory test changes, believe it. People like pretty pictures, so I do neuroimaging research. You got to know how to sell your stuff. Estrogen enhances the functioning of the hippocampus. And indeed, if you start before the final menstrual period, it looks good. Many of you are probably saying, well, Women's Health Initiative, come on, it doubled the risk of dementia. I suggest you read the JAMA paper by Manson, 2018, that showed in the appendix that women were less likely to get Alzheimer's disease if they were randomized to estrogen. Good news. So let's talk about sex-specific risk factors for cognitive dysfunction. We used to think that hot flashes were these short-lived phenomenon. You got over them after the final menstrual period. Work from the study of women's health across the nation shows that hot flashes continue in 10% of women more than a decade after the final menstrual period, and they're moderate or severe. We think this is a group of women who could be at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease, and thankfully we sold it to the NIA. So why is that? We measure hot flashes objectively. You want to design a dumb study? Ask women, how many hot flashes did you have in the last 2 weeks? And then give them a memory test and see if they correlate. That's a memory test, right? So you have to measure hot flashes objectively, which we do in real time. So women wear these monitors. They push the 2 buttons when they think they're having a hot flash. We have 2 electrodes on the sternum. It measures skin conductance, so we measure sweating. And there's this very characteristic sweating response when we have these flashes. We found, like everybody else, no relationship between the hot flashes that a woman reports and the hot flashes and her memory performance. None at all. That's what everybody else finds. However, we and others have shown that women, far from being hypochondriacal, complaining little women, underreport their hot flashes. They're not good at reporting their hot flashes. Actually, they're busy doing other things, so they're not necessarily paying attention to them. So when you use the monitors, you see a very strong relationship between magnitude of memory impairment, white matter hyperintensities on brain structure, and brain functioning changes in the default mode network, which might be what you're activating right now. That's if you're not really paying attention and your brain's just kind of wandering. That's a default mode, and what your brain does when it's not doing much of anything at all tells you a lot about brain functioning. So only when you measure hot flashes objectively do you see that they're linked to memory dysfunction, white matter hyperintensities, and changes in brain function. Why? We think because every time you have a hot flash, you have a surge in glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoid levels in women with hot flashes are significantly higher, and women's brains are more vulnerable to glucocorticoids than men. So we think this is a key mechanism. Why else do we need to pay attention to this verbal memory, hot flashes, menopause? Because it turns out, in work that I've been very fortunate to mentor, Aaron Sunderman, who's at the University of California at San Diego, we've discovered something that seems to be pretty important, and that is that if I test a man on a verbal memory test, and he gets a 10, and I test a woman on a verbal memory test, and she gets a 10, she has a whole lot more Alzheimer's disease pathology than the man. Why? Because she started out with better verbal memory. Logical, right? Makes a lot of sense. Doesn't matter if you look at this, if you're looking at hippocampal volume, or if you're looking at the amount of beta amyloid on a neuroimaging study. You see the same thing. So what's the solution? Sex-based norms. You use one cutoff for women to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, you use another cutoff for men. So that's where our work is right now, and we just tried this out in a study out in UCSD, and we found, in fact, that not only does that benefit women, not only are you seeing more cases of Alzheimer's disease earlier, but you're not diagnosing men falsely with Alzheimer's disease. Right? Because if women are raising the mean and a man falls below that, you could falsely diagnose a man. So the idea is that if you take the science, you understand these sex and gender-based differences, you do work that advances the quality of care for both men and women. So we at the Society for Women's Health Research, and is Neelam in the audience? Where's Neelam? Neelam Agarwal, a former recipient of the Women in Science Award from ABWAN, a Mentee Award this year. She's part of our panel. It's been an honor to lead this. We've come up with priorities for research on Alzheimer's disease in women. This will come out in an issue of the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease dedicated to women in Alzheimer's disease, so it's all changing, which is very good. Okay, I'd like to thank the University of Illinois at Chicago, my collaborators. The best thing about science is the people you meet. It's amazing. I want to thank all of my mentees and my funding agencies, and thank you for your attention.